They fired the black single dad and laughed. Then he made one call: fire every one of them. James Whitfield stood in the parking lot of Cresthaven Logistics, holding a cardboard box with 12 years of his life crammed inside it. His hands were steady. His face was calm. Behind him, through the glass doors, he could still hear them laughing. "Did you see his face?" someone said. "Thought he was somebody." Marcus Delaney, regional director, stood at the top of the steps with his arms crossed, grinning like he'd just won a bet. "Don't let the door hit you, Whitfield. Some people just aren't cut out for corporate." James didn't turn around right away. He set the box down on the hood of his old Honda Civic. He pulled out his phone. And he made one call. It rang twice. "This is James," he said quietly. "I need you to pull the Cresthaven account. All of it. Effective immediately." He paused, listening. "No. I don't want a review. I don't want a warning letter. Fire every one of them. Starting with the regional director." Behind him, the laughter had stopped. Marcus's smile was still frozen on his face, but something in his eyes had changed, like a man who just heard a door lock behind him that he didn't know was there. "Who," Marcus said slowly, stepping down onto the pavement, "were you just talking to?" James turned around. For the first time all day, he actually smiled. "You'll find out Monday," he said. "Enjoy your weekend while you still have a job to come back to." 3 weeks earlier, none of this would have made any sense at all. 3 weeks earlier, James Whitfield was just the quiet guy in receiving, the one who showed up early, kept his head down, and never said much more than morning and have a good one. Nobody at Cresthaven Logistics knew who he really was. And that was exactly how he'd planned it. James was 44 years old, a widower, and the father of an 11-year-old girl named Simone who had his late wife's eyes and his own stubborn chin. He drove a car with 190,000 miles on it. He wore the same 3 button-down shirts on rotation, always ironed, always tucked in. He was, by every outward appearance, an ordinary man doing an ordinary job. He'd taken the position at Cresthaven 8 months earlier, working the receiving dock and inventory logs for $18 an hour. To his coworkers, he was just another middle-aged black man in a company polo, easy to overlook, easy to underestimate. Nobody asked him about his life before Cresthaven. Nobody asked why a man his age was starting over at an entry-level warehouse job. If they had asked, they would have learned something that would have changed everything. But nobody asked. And James never offered. What they didn't know was that 14 years earlier, James Whitfield had built a supply chain consulting firm from nothing, a company that eventually managed logistics contracts for some of the biggest retail chains on the East Coast. What they didn't know was that he had walked away from all of it 4 years ago, after his wife Denise died of cancer, because he couldn't stand to be in boardrooms anymore when all he wanted was to be home with his daughter. He'd sold his stake in the company to his old business partner, kept a small consulting retainer that paid his mortgage without anyone needing to know his name, and taken a quiet job where nobody would recognize him or ask him to travel or ask him to be anything other than a dad who came home every night at 5:30. He wanted invisibility. He wanted simplicity. What he got, instead, was Marcus Delaney. Marcus was 36, the youngest regional director in Cresthaven's history, and he never let anyone forget it. He'd inherited the position from his uncle, who sat on the company's board, and he wore his authority like a costume that didn't quite fit yet. He had a way of talking to warehouse staff that was technically polite and somehow still condescending, like he was doing them a favor by remembering their names. Marcus had a favorite phrase. He used it in meetings, in hallways, in the break room. "We're a family here," he'd say, right before doing something that no reasonable family would ever do to one of its own. The dislike started small. It always does. It started with the schedule. James had arranged his hours around Simone's school pickup, an agreement he'd made with his previous supervisor, a woman named Patty who'd since retired. Patty had understood. Marcus, when he took over the region, did not. "I don't see anything in writing about a special arrangement," Marcus said, flipping through a file in his office 3 weeks after he arrived, not bothering to look up. "Everybody works the same shift here. That's fair. I have a letter from Patty, James said. I can bring it in tomorrow. You do that, Marcus said, already moving on to something else on his desk. Until then, you're on the regular schedule. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was carelessness, the kind that comes from a man who has never once had to reroute his entire day around someone else's need. James brought him the letter the next morning. Marcus barely glanced at it before setting it aside, and the schedule stayed exactly the same for another 9 days, until James finally cornered HR directly and got it sorted out himself. 9 days. 9 days of Simone waiting an extra 40 minutes at the after-school program, watching the door for her father's car. That was Incident 1. Incident 2 came a month later, during a team meeting about a new inventory software rollout. James raised his hand and pointed out, calmly and correctly, that the proposed barcode scanning system would create a bottleneck at the loading dock during peak hours, because it didn't account for the way trucks were staged. Interesting theory, Marcus said, with a small laugh that rippled through the room. But I think we'll let the actual logistics team handle the logistics, yeah? A few people chuckled. James said nothing. He just nodded and went back to his notepad. 6 weeks later, the system rolled out exactly the way James had predicted it would fail. The loading dock backed up for 2 straight days. Marcus never mentioned it again, and he never mentioned James's warning either. Incident 3 was smaller, but it was the one that stuck with James the longest, because it wasn't really about him at all. There was a young man on the receiving team named Andre, 19 years old, quiet, still living with his grandmother because his parents weren't in the picture. Andre worked hard. He showed up on time. He was saving up for community college classes in the spring. One afternoon, Marcus walked through the warehouse with a client on a tour and stopped near Andre's station. "This is one of our newer hires," Marcus said to the client, gesturing at Andre like he was pointing out a piece of equipment. "Good with his hands, not much for the paperwork side, if you know what I mean. We keep him on the floor." Andre's face didn't change. He kept scanning boxes. But James, standing 20 feet away, saw the young man's jaw tighten, saw him swallow whatever he wanted to say, saw him go quiet in the particular way that people go quiet when they've learned that saying something never helps. That night, James drove Andre home because his car was in the shop. They didn't talk about what Marcus had said. James just asked him about his classes, listened to him talk about wanting to study supply chain management, actually study it, with textbooks and exams and a degree at the end of it. James told him that was a smart field to get into. He didn't say anything else. But he remembered it. Incident 4 was the one that finally tipped things. Cresthaven had an annual innovation bonus, a small cash award given to whichever employee submitted the best cost-saving idea for the warehouse. James submitted a proposal to restructure the receiving bay's staging system, a plan that would cut turnaround time by nearly 30%. He wrote it up carefully over 2 weekends, with diagrams, with real numbers pulled from his own tracking of the dock over several months. Marcus's assistant manager, a woman named Debbie who mostly did what Marcus told her to do, reviewed the submissions. James's plan won, clearly, by every metric they used to judge it. Marcus gave the bonus to a supervisor named Todd instead, a man who had submitted a much smaller idea about switching to a different brand of packing tape. "Todd's been here longer," Marcus explained, when James asked him about it directly, standing in his office doorway. "We like to reward loyalty around here." "I've been here 8 months, James said. That wasn't the criteria in the bonus announcement. "Well," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair, "maybe next year, if you stick around long enough to prove yourself." Stick around long enough to prove yourself. James had built and sold a company that once handled $40 million in annual freight contracts. He said nothing. He walked away. That night, after Simone went to bed, he sat at his kitchen table with his old business partner's number pulled up on his phone, his thumb hovering over the call button for a long time before he set the phone back down. Not yet, he told himself. Not yet. Throughout all of this, there were small clues, if anyone had cared to notice them. James's old friend Curtis, who ran an ID checkpoint at the front gate on weekends, once called out to him across the parking lot, "Hey, Whitfield, still can't believe you're stacking boxes after everything you built," and James had just laughed it off and waved him quiet, telling him to keep it down. Nobody else was around to hear it, but Marcus's assistant Debbie had been walking to her car at the time, close enough to catch the tail end of it. She hadn't understood what it meant. She'd just filed it away as odd. There was also the afternoon a delivery driver, an older man who'd been hauling freight for 30 years, recognized James from across the loading dock and called him Mr. Whitfield instead of just James, with a strange kind of respect in his voice, like he was greeting someone he used to work for. James had quietly asked him to just call him James like everybody else. The driver had looked confused but complied. And there was the day James fixed a routing error in the shipping software in about 4 minutes that had stumped Cresthaven's IT contractor for 3 days. He didn't make a big deal of it. He just sat down, looked at the back end for a few minutes, and pointed out the misconfigured node. The IT contractor had asked him, half joking, "Where'd you learn to do that?" James had just shrugged and said, "Picked it up somewhere," and gone back to work. Small things. Quiet things. Nobody put them together. Nobody was looking. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in early spring. James had asked for the following Monday off, 3 weeks in advance, submitted through the proper channels, approved in writing by Debbie. Simone had a school event, a big one, a science fair where she was presenting a project on water filtration that she'd worked on for 2 months. She'd built the model herself, tested it herself, and she'd asked her father, with the kind of hopeful nervousness only an 11-year-old can carry, if he'd be there to see it. "I wouldn't miss it," James had told her. "Not for anything." On Friday afternoon, Marcus called James into his office. "Change of plans," Marcus said, not looking up from his computer. "We've got a client audit Monday morning. All hands. I need you here." "I have approved leave for Monday," James said. "It's on the calendar. Debbie signed off on it 3 weeks ago." "Debbie doesn't run this office," Marcus said. "I do. And I need bodies on the floor when the client walks through." "It's my daughter's science fair," James said. His voice was even, but there was something underneath it now, something that had been building for 8 months. "She's presenting at 10 a.m. I told her I'd be there." Marcus finally looked up. There was a flicker of something in his face, not quite cruelty, more like boredom, like he found the whole conversation slightly tedious. "Look," Marcus said, "I get it. Kids, school stuff, all that. But this is a job. If it's between a client walkthrough and a school project, I think you know which one matters more around here." "I don't think I do know that," James said quietly. Marcus sighed, the sigh of a man who considered himself endlessly patient with people who couldn't understand simple things. "Fine. If you can't handle basic scheduling flexibility, maybe this isn't the right fit for you. I've got people who'd take this job seriously." "Are you firing me for taking approved leave to watch my daughter's science fair?" "I'm saying," Marcus said, standing up now, "that loyalty goes both ways. And I'm not seeing a lot of it from you." James looked at him for a long moment. Something had shifted behind his eyes, something calm and final, like a decision that had been circling for months had finally landed. "Okay," James said. "Understood." He turned and left the office. He didn't argue further. He didn't raise his voice. He just walked back to the receiving dock, finished his shift, and went home. Monday morning, James was in the third row of folding chairs in his daughter's school gymnasium, watching Simone explain her water filtration model to a panel of judges with more confidence than he'd ever managed in his entire career. She used the word turbidity correctly 3 times. She pointed at her charts like a seasoned professional. James recorded the whole thing on his phone, and when she finished and found him in the crowd, he stood up and clapped louder than anyone else in that gymnasium, and he didn't care one bit who saw him do it. She won second place in her grade division. They got ice cream on the way home to celebrate anyway. Tuesday morning, James walked into Cresthaven and was called into HR before he'd even clocked in. A woman named Renata, apologetic and clearly uncomfortable, slid a termination letter across the desk. Unauthorized absence. Failure to prioritize essential business operations. Effective immediately. For the record, Renata said quietly, not quite meeting his eyes, I want you to know this came directly from Marcus. I flagged that your leave was approved. I was overruled. I appreciate you saying that, James said. He packed his box. He walked out through the warehouse floor one last time, past Andre, who looked up from his station with something like grief on his face, past Debbie, who wouldn't meet his eyes, past the loading dock he'd redesigned in his head 100 times without anyone ever asking him to. Marcus was waiting by the front doors with 2 supervisors, not even pretending not to enjoy it. Didn't work out, huh? Marcus said, loud enough for the group behind him to hear. Guess loyalty really doesn't run both ways. That was when the laughter started, quiet at first, then a little louder when Marcus grinned and shook his head like he'd just watched a mildly funny sitcom rerun. James walked past all of them without a word, out into the parking lot, and set his box down on the hood of his car. And that was when he made the call. The truth was this. 4 years ago, when James sold his stake in Whitfield Logistics Partners, he hadn't sold all of it. He'd kept a minority ownership position, quiet and unlisted, in exchange for staying off the operational side of the business entirely. His old partner, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Renee Okafor, had run the company since then, growing it into one of the largest third-party logistics consultancies on the East Coast. And 6 months ago, in one of the quieter deals of the year, Whitfield Logistics Partners had acquired a controlling contract to manage vendor relationships for a mid-sized trucking and freight conglomerate. The name of that conglomerate's regional partner, the one whose contract they now controlled, was Cresthaven Logistics. James had known this when he took the receiving job 8 months earlier. It was, in fact, exactly why he'd taken it. Renee had asked him, half as a joke and half seriously, to spend some time on the ground at one of their new partner sites before the ink on the deal dried, just to get an honest read on how things were actually run down at the warehouse level, away from the polished reports regional directors sent up the chain. James, grieving, restless, and needing something to do with his hands that wasn't a boardroom, had said yes. He hadn't expected to fall into a real routine there. He hadn't expected Marcus. And he certainly hadn't expected to end up needing every bit of what he'd learned in 8 months of quiet, humiliating observation. The call he made from the parking lot was to Renee. It's done, James said. Everything I told you. All of it, confirmed, and then some. Pull the contract review forward. I want the full staff review by Monday. You sure? Renee asked. Once I start this, it's not something we walk back. James looked up at the glass doors of Cresthaven, where Marcus stood grinning, not yet understanding what he'd just done. I'm sure, James said. Fire every one of them who deserves it. Starting with Marcus Delaney. Monday morning, a black car pulled into the Cresthaven parking lot at 8 a.m. sharp. Renee Okafor stepped out first, sharp suit, sharper expression, a tablet under her arm. Behind her came 2 members of her compliance team. And behind them, stepping out last, wearing the same simple button-down shirt he always wore, was James Whitfield. The regional office manager who greeted them at the door didn't recognize James at first. It was Renee who spoke. We're here to see Marcus Delaney, she said. Whitfield Logistics Partners. We manage the vendor oversight contract for this facility as of 6 months ago. I believe there's some confusion about how that relationship has been represented internally. Word moved through the warehouse faster than anyone could have predicted. By the time Marcus came out of his office, half the floor staff had already gathered near the break room windows, watching. Marcus's face, when he saw James standing beside Renee, went through several stages very quickly. Confusion first. Then recognition. Then something that looked almost like physical pain. James, Marcus said. What is this? This is Whitfield Logistics Partners, Renee said, before James could answer. James is a founding partner. He's also been your vendor oversight liaison for the past 8 months, in an operational capacity you were never informed of, which, frankly, is unusual, but was his call to make. I trust you'll want to explain to me why an approved leave request was overturned so that an employee could be terminated the following business day, especially given what our review has already uncovered about scheduling patterns, bonus allocations, and a few other matters we'll be discussing today. Marcus's mouth opened and closed twice before anything came out. There's been a misunderstanding, he finally managed. James, I had no idea. If I'd known who you— That's exactly the problem, James said, and his voice was calm, the same calm voice he'd used every single day for 8 months, except now everyone in that warehouse was actually listening to it. You didn't need to know who I was to treat me decently. Nobody does. That's kind of the whole point. Marcus's face went pale, then red, then pale again. Behind him, Debbie had gone very still. Todd, the supervisor who'd gotten the bonus, had quietly slipped toward the back of the crowd. James, Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly, all the smugness of the parking lot completely drained out of him now. Come on. We can figure this out. I was just doing my job, running a tight ship, you understand that, right? Business is business. Business is business, James repeated slowly. You said that to me the day you gave Todd's packing tape idea a bonus over a proposal that would have saved this facility $200,000 a year. You said something like that the day you told a 19-year-old kid in front of a client that he wasn't much for paperwork. And you definitely said something like that the day you told me my daughter's science fair mattered less than a client walkthrough that, by the way, went fine without me. So yeah. Business is business. Let's talk business. Renee's team spent the rest of the morning going through payroll records, scheduling logs, disciplinary files, and bonus documentation. What they found wasn't just Marcus's treatment of James. It was a pattern going back nearly 2 years, shift assignments that consistently disadvantaged employees with childcare responsibilities, almost all of them single parents, almost all of them women or people of color, a disciplinary record that showed Marcus wrote up minor infractions far more aggressively for hourly staff than for salaried supervisors, and at least 3 other bonus decisions that didn't match the stated criteria, all of them benefiting people Marcus golfed with on weekends. Marcus was terminated that afternoon, effective immediately, escorted out by building security while a small crowd of the same people who had laughed in that parking lot 3 days earlier now watched in complete silence. Debbie was called in separately. She sat across from Renee and James, visibly shaking. I want to be honest with you, Debbie said. I knew some of this wasn't right. The scheduling thing with James, I flagged it to Marcus myself, more than once. I didn't push hard enough. I told myself it wasn't my place, that I just work here, that I needed this job too. I should have done more. James looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Andre, and about the science fair, and about 9 days of Simone waiting at an after-school program for a father who was fighting his own quiet fight and losing it slowly. You're not the one who made the decisions, James said finally. You're the one who watched them get made and didn't stop them. That's not nothing. But it's not the same thing as pulling the trigger either. I think there's a difference between people who do harm and people who fail to stop it. You're the second kind. That's still a mistake. It's not the same crime. Renee looked at James, a silent question in her expression. James gave a small nod. We're not terminating you, Renee said to Debbie. But you're being moved into a compliance training role, effective this week, mandatory, and you'll be personally responsible for making sure nothing like this happens again on this floor. Consider it a second chance you're going to have to earn every single day. Debbie's eyes welled up. Thank you, she said quietly. I won't waste it. Todd's case was different. The audit found he'd known his packing tape idea wasn't actually the top submission, that Marcus had told him directly he was getting the bonus regardless, and Todd had said nothing, taken the money, and let James believe the decision had been made honestly. That wasn't passive silence. That was quiet participation for personal gain. Todd was let go by the end of the week, though Renee, at James's suggestion, made sure his severance was fair and that his file wouldn't follow him with anything worse than position eliminated. He's a grown man who chose to profit off someone else's work getting stolen, James told Renee privately. He should face consequences. But he's got 2 kids of his own. No need to make sure he can't feed them either. The following Monday, James walked back onto the Cresthaven floor, not in a company polo this time, but in a simple gray suit that fit him the way a suit fits a man who's worn 100 of them before and never much cared for the ceremony of it. He gathered the receiving and warehouse staff together, the same group that had watched him carry a cardboard box out to his car a week earlier. "I'm not going to stand up here and give some big speech about power or justice," James said. "That's not really who I am. I'm the same guy who worked next to you for 8 months, the same guy whose kid you all probably heard me talk about way too much." A few people laughed quietly. "What I will say," James went on, "is that I built this business a long time ago because I believed the people doing the actual work, the people on the floor, in the truck, at the dock, deserve to be led by someone who sees them as people first. Somewhere along the way, that got lost here. That's on me too, honestly, because I let it go on longer than I should have while I was gathering information instead of stepping in sooner. I'm sorry for that." He looked out at the crowd until his eyes landed on Andre, standing near the back, arms crossed, watching carefully. "Andre," James said. "Come up here a second." Andre hesitated, then walked forward, clearly unsure what was happening. Whitfield Logistics Partners funds 2 full-ride tuition scholarships a year for employees pursuing degrees in supply chain and logistics management, James said. "Starting today, one of them has your name on it, if you want it. You've got real instincts for this work. I've watched you for months. You just needed somebody to actually look." Andre's throat worked for a second before he could speak. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," James said, smiling. "That's usually a good start." "Yes," Andre said, and the whole floor broke into applause, real applause, the kind that comes from people who've been waiting a long time to see something go right. James didn't fire everyone, in the end. Renee's audit turned up 2 other supervisors with genuinely troubling records, and they were let go along with Marcus. But most of the floor staff, the people who'd simply shown up, done their jobs, and stayed quiet because staying quiet felt like the only safe option in a place run by someone like Marcus, kept their positions. Several got raises, once James pushed through a full pay equity review 3 weeks later. The scheduling policy that had cost James 9 days with his daughter was rewritten within a month, and posted, laminated, right by the break room door, so nobody could claim confusion about it again. James didn't take over as regional director. He wasn't interested in running Cresthaven day to day. Instead, he asked Renee to bring in a new manager from within the company's ranks, someone who already understood what it meant to work the floor, someone recommended, in fact, by nearly every hourly employee at the facility when they were quietly asked who they trusted. It was Debbie, 6 months into her compliance role, having more than proven she'd learned the lesson she needed to learn. As for James, he went back to being, mostly, an ordinary man. He picked Simone up from school most days. He coached her science fair project the next year too, though this time he made sure his calendar was blocked off 2 months in advance, with no meetings allowed to touch it, not even his own. He still drove the old Honda Civic for another year, until it finally gave out, and even then he replaced it with something almost as unremarkable. But every few months, he'd visit a Whitfield Logistics Partners site somewhere new, unannounced, in a plain shirt, and just watch how people were treated when nobody thought anyone important was paying attention. He figured that was the truest test of any place, and any person. Not how they behaved in front of someone with power. How they behaved when they thought no one who mattered was watching at all. One evening, Simone asked him about it, curled up next to him on the couch after he'd told her, finally, the whole story of what had happened at Cresthaven. "Were you mad at them?" she asked. "The people who laughed at you?" James thought about it for a long moment. "I was hurt," he said. "Mad, too, for a little while. But mostly, I just wanted them to understand something. You can't always tell what someone's carrying by looking at them. The quiet guy stacking boxes might have built something bigger than the building you're standing in. The kid nobody thinks is smart might end up running the whole operation someday. People deserve respect before you know their story, not after." "So what did you learn?" Simone asked. James smiled, pulling her a little closer. That having power doesn't mean much, he said, if you don't use it to make things fairer for people who don't have any. That's the only kind of power worth having at all.